I want to say hello and welcome everyone to the final teaching module of the HMCT Design Educators Typography Intensive. I'm Gloria Kondrup. I'm the Executive Director of the Hoffmitz Milken Center for Typography. It is our mantra for the DETI that effective teaching should be shared, not a secret. We want to thank Google for their generous support, and of course, support from Art Center College of Design and the Lowell Milken Family Foundation. So this has been a very interesting and long day, and it's all, I thought it's made its way up to this point to generative type. And I think Dave Crossan led a wonderful foundation talking about variable fonts and how technology is changing fonts. And I know you and Roy will continue a little bit about Roy and Brad. They're both educators. They both teach here at Art Center College of Design, and they teach, I would say, our most advanced students, right? Roy is a Los Angeles-based multidisciplinary designer, and you worked on everything from wearables to websites to apps, printed matter. He's worked for companies like Apple and Nike. You know, I mean, it's amazing when I think about this. You are currently teaching the generative design and generative typography classes here at Art Center. And the classes explore how code can be used within the context of graphic design. And I think it's one of our newer additions to the curriculum. Brad Bartlett is our designer, educator, and author, right? Fabulous, and he's done some absolutely fantastic work, I know, on book designs. Brad developed he's the faculty director of Transmedia design in both graduate and undergraduate design programs here at Art Center. And Brad, you developed the whole curriculum and the whole concept of what is transmedia, you know, and I think you also published a course recently on transmedia typography, didn't you? Is that on LinkedIn already, Brad?
It's LinkedIn Learning, Advanced Transmedia Typography. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to step back and I'm going to let you guys, I'm going to unshare my screen and I'm going to say a big thank you. And I'll pop back when you guys are finished with your module.
All right. Well, thanks again, Gloria. I'm just super excited to support Roy today, assist him in his presentation. And when Roy was a student at Art Center many years ago, he was my teaching assistant. And so we were joking this morning that in many ways, things have kind of come full circle. As a teacher, there's nothing more gratifying than to have one of your students come back and teach. So this is something very special for me and for Roy. Before we take a deep dive into Roy's classroom, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and share a video that showcases many of the projects across our area of study in transmedia. The work I'm sharing is from our Advanced Transmedia Studio class, our Type 5 Transmedia class, and our Media Texture class taught by Miles Mazzi and Ivan Cruz. Okay, cool. Well, in Transmedia, we use emerging tools and technologies to respond to the changing social and technological conditions of visual communication. We aspire to create seamless experiences across both traditional and emerging media, crossing over from print to screen to spatial media. And so that's illustrated in the crossbar of the T. In that process, we encourage students to develop a deep understanding of the unique opportunities each media type affords.
One thing that feels really unique too about the transmedia curriculum within the program is the opportunity for projects to be explored simultaneously across 2 or 3 classes, as well as multiple mediums. So classes like media texture and generative design or typography give students a better understanding of new and emerging tools and technologies, and developing the design and content for projects in a class like Type 5 really gives students the space in classes like generative typography to really experiment and explore these new mediums in a hands-on focused way without having to worry about developing the content and learn code at the same time within the scope of the same class.
All right, so we just want to give kind of a brief kind of overview of our transmedia, kind of curriculum. Now what we want to do is kind of zoom into Roy's class, take a seat in Roy's class, and have him take us through a couple different things. He's going to take us through a brief history of computational design in relation to graphic design. He's going to take us through a series of exercises that he gives his students in the class. And then we'll kind of zoom out and we'll talk about a few case studies that contextualize the dynamic work from his classes inside a larger transmedia branding ecosystem.
Cool. So this is an excerpt from a lecture that I give during the first week of my class that's really about, kind of code and graphic design and art. So when we're talking about code in the class, typically you might think of math or science, but really what we're focusing on is communication. So students are learning how to communicate with a computer. This language that they're learning has grammar and syntax and a system for writing, just like any other language. And we really emphasize communication. It's more about learning the rules of the language and how it's structured.
Yeah, so what Roy always says that I think resonates very deeply with graphic design students is that you don't have to be really good at math to be really good at code.
Totally. And I really like sharing this quote from John Maeda with students at the beginning of the class too. It says, "Drawing a stroke with a pen is no different from drawing a stroke with a mouse. The real challenge is to discover the intrinsic properties of the new medium and how to find out how the stroke you draw via computation is one you could never draw or even imagine without computation." So this is from the book Design by Numbers, which is a book that acts as a document and manual to the software by the same name that he created while at MIT. And this really gets students thinking about how the tools we use affect the forms that we make. So what he's advocating for here is to take advantage of the things afforded to us by the medium. So if we're designing a logo or letter forms that are going to be displayed on a website, what are the affordances of the web and of screens that we can leverage within the work? So for example, the computer is probably connected to the internet. Maybe we use live data to manipulate the logo or letter forms. Also, the screen is dynamic and not fixed. So maybe the logo too could be dynamic, animated, and in motion. This is a project from Letter that kind of does what John Maeda is describing. So this typeface called Beowulf was created by hacking the PostScript code that renders fonts on a laser printer as the document was printing. So the code over time creates more and more distortion within the letter forms, as you can see here in this issue of Emigre, where they publish the essay Is Best Really Better, which is also typeset in Beowulf. And so graphic designers have always adapted to new technologies. What happens if we embrace code as a tool as part of our process? Brad and I have talked a lot in the past about how designers adapted to the personal computer in the 90s, embracing it as a new medium, which we all comfortably use now. But at the same time, this hasn't really happened for code as much as it's become a medium that's been explored over the last 2 decades or so.
It's really interesting. With the personal computer, it really democratized the tools for creating typefaces for type design. And that was incredibly empowering for graphic designers in the early 90s, early 90s. And so what we're really interested in now is how graphic designers can actively create the tools that they might use to then create the letter forms that they would draw.
Yeah, so the classes are really focused on this idea of tools because I think at a meta level, this is what we're doing when we're writing software. we're creating our own tools, and these tools will change the way that the work looks and feels and behaves. Typography and typographic forms have evolved alongside the technology used for communicating, with each new medium having its own set of tools used for rendering text. So here we're looking at two letter A's, one made with a brush and one made with code, each containing traces of the tool that was used to create it.
So again, the forms that we create are always a reflection of the tools that we choose to use.
And this quote from Marshall McLuhan and or John Colkin sums it up nicely. The tool, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. So the tools that we're using really have an impact on us. They impact our thinking, our approach, our making, what's even possible to create when using them. And by selecting a particular tool, we're agreeing to a specific way of working. We're also kind of predetermining the type of output that we're going to get as well. So what happens when we add computation to our toolkit? What happens when we start to create our own tools or figure out ways of subverting or hacking pre-existing tools? This is an example of trying to hack an existing system to make your own tools. This is the work of Jörg Lenny in a project called Scriptographer, which is a plugin that allowed someone to write JavaScript inside of Illustrator. So this extended the Illustrator presets and allowed people to create their own tools while leveraging the possibilities of code to generate form. He describes the project on his website in this way. Scriptographer allows us to reclaim a more personal relationship we used to have with our tools and reintroduce interesting points of friction and elements of craft into our highly optimized software, with the aim to learn to create tools ourselves. After all, the computer was invented as a tool to create tools. So within a lot of design and art education settings, we teach how to use the computer as a tool, but rarely teach how to create tools using the computer. And this approach to working and thinking isn't necessarily new. Designers and artists have been applying computational thinking to their work for decades. Things like grid systems are really analogous to code. This way of working that we present to the students in the class has a history, which I want to briefly touch on some elements of now. We talk in the class a lot about Carl Gerstner and his book, Designing Programs. The diagram on the right is one such program. It's a system that can be used to generate a number of logos or word marks by creating variations in response to the outlined components. So someone using this diagram could generate a number of different options by picking attributes from the sections and then analyzing and selecting a logo that feels the most appropriate for the project. And this process of generating form, analyzing the output, and selecting one or a group is the same process that we go through when we're working on generative design projects.
In many ways, Gerstner is kind of anticipating this shift that we have from crafting singular artifacts to devising larger systems within which unique artifacts and experiences can emerge and be created.
So artists around this same time were also exploring computational approaches to art. So this is the work of Sol LeWitt. And in his wall drawing series, the work itself that he was creating is a set of instructions that someone would use to generate the art in the space of the gallery. So on the left, you see a piece that he's created, which is the instructions for the work. And on the right, you see an installation of a piece that's been created by following the instructions given by the artist. Within the field of graphic design, the work Muriel Cooper was doing for MIT as director of the Visible Language Workshop was beginning to explore how to manipulate tools and work with new and emerging technologies like code, with a lot of experimentation done with type, image, and different printing methods and processes. One thing that I like to mention in class is that Cooper was really interested in having a shorter time between thinking and making. So with code, the time from input to output can be really short and allows for us to feed back the input into the output, reducing the time between thinking and making.
Yeah, what a remarkable career. What I find to be super interesting about Muriel Cooper's career is that, she was a very iconic book designer, and yet she was a pioneer in using digital technology and computational design practices and bringing that into a graphic design discipline. So in many ways, a lot of the crossover between analog and digital media that we like to explore in our classrooms today have an earlier precedent in the way that she approached things with the formation of the Media Lab.
And after Cooper, John Maeda started a research group called the Aesthetics and Computation Group that really starts exploring the medium of code and how to make it more accessible to a larger audience. So this is some of his work from around that time, a poster series that was used, that was generated using Adobe PostScript. an early example of code and type used within a graphic design context. During his time at MIT, he created Design by Numbers. So Design by Numbers was a way for non-programmers to work with a simplified syntax and program structure that made it really easy to learn and see the possibilities of working with code. So inspired by that, processing, which was created around 2001 by Casey Reese and Ben Fry while they were studying at MIT, kind of came about. And prior to tools like processing, the barrier for entry into working with code was pretty high. And the goal for this project was to make software more accessible to artists and designers and easier to integrate into an art or design curriculum. This is the primary tool we use in the classes I teach because the syntax is easy for students to pick up and work with. This is a screenshot of the alpha version. It looks a little bit different right now. So we are focusing on processing, but I want to touch on some other tools that I think are related and sometimes used within the scope of the class as well. So this is Open Frameworks, which was created around 2005. Open Frameworks is built with C++ and is a wrapper that combines several libraries together, making it easy to work with things like computer vision, for example. And this project has the same goal as processing, to create something that would be used by artists and designers in the creation of their own tools and form making. We don't really cover this as much in the class, but there's a lot of great resources on their site that students sometimes check out when they're interested in diving deeper into code. This is a newer tool that I introduced last term. It's called Bazel.js. It's similar to Scriptographer, and it gives you the ability to write processing-esque syntax in InDesign. So some students have really begun exploring this more since I introduced it because it's a great way to connect a lot of the code-based work that we're learning in classes like generative typography to the medium of print, which they're working with across the rest of their classes.
What I love about this is that it begins to anticipate the opportunities that we have in print-based media to use code and question our preconceived notions that code can only exist within screen-based media.
And more recently, around 2015, processing was reinterpreted for the web as P5.js. So P5.js and processing are really similar in terms of syntax and structure. And it's really easy for students to move between processing and P5.js when they need to work on a website versus an interactive installation, for example. So processing, P5.js, and Bazel.js are the three main tools that we focus on in the class. And I want to walk through how the class is structured and show some examples of student work at the same time, as well as talk about the approach for how to teach students how to work with type and code. So when I'm starting the class and starting to discuss working with code with students, I really love sharing this quote from Donald Knuth. It says, "Meta design is much more difficult than design. It's easier to draw something than to explain how to draw it." So this connects back to what I was talking about before with focusing on communication. We're learning how to explain how to draw something. And quite literally in the class, in the very first class, all the students take turns trying to write a series of instructions on how to draw a letter form. And then they give those instructions to another student in the class, and then everyone takes turns going up to the whiteboard to try to draw that letter. And they quickly realize how important communication is to the work that we'll be doing in the class.
What I love about this assignment is it really kind of demystifies the idea of what an algorithm is and makes it accessible to an everyday experience. You know, again, it's simply a set of instructions.
We spent a lot of time at the beginning of the class too, kind of diagramming and discussing this process that we're going to be going through week over week. So this is from a book called Generative Design that's also a really great reference and teaching resource. So here, this is an overview of what the generative design process looks like. So we start with an idea. So in this example, we're doing branding for a music festival, and we want to create a dynamic type-driven wayfinding system that's reacting to the sounds of the music that the musicians are playing. We then take that idea and abstract it into a set of rules or instructions. So here you can see a list of steps that we would go through in order to bring that idea to life. We then take those steps and translate them into code, and then arrive at an output based on the code that we created. We then enter this loop of analyzing the output, making tweaks to the steps or code until we reach something that we want to move forward with in the design. And so, you know, abstracting the process to these 4 steps is something that really helps students understand how to approach the beginning of writing code.
What's really nice about that example is it underscores the need for designers to work in a very, very iterative manner. that you test drive ideas, you make small tweaks, and you continue to test drive those ideas until you arrive at something that effectively resonates for you or for an intended audience.
Yeah, iteration is a big part of that process too, and something that we spend a lot of time talking about, especially as students are first writing code. There's a little bit of hesitation to deleting and rewriting things. But tools like processing are really built to be, the programs you write are called sketches, and they're meant to be treated as such.
Totally.
We also start the class with this question: what are the boundaries of generative typography? We might have something in our head when we think of the term. Maybe it's an animated or dynamic logo or typeface. So I really like to move from the micro to the macro when it comes to the class, because I try to make the scope of work as broad as possible and really open to an exploration of combining code and typography. So in the class, students work through a weekly set of code-based demos and exercises that progress from letters to working with larger bodies of text. So I'll walk through what that looks like now. So we're starting here with letters and words. We start by exploring approaches to modular type design with the intent of having the letter forms come to life via code. We really like working with modular type design because the modules of the letter forms align nicely to blocks of code in the process of using code to render typography. Both modular type and code have an underlying system and set of rules or logic that make them work well together. Also, formally, they're a little bit more forgiving. And so while we're still learning and exploring writing code, modular typefaces really provide a nice canvas for us to explore within. So this is the work of a student named Jimena Amaya. It's a modular typeface that she created within this class and Brad's Type 5 class as part of an identity system for the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. It was inspired by the architecture of Mexico's ancient culture. So these are spreads from a specimen book that she created that detail the design.
It's really quite beautiful. You see that within the tightly gridded system that she's devised, there's a really beautiful interplay between positive and negative, figure and ground. And the letter forms themselves are responsive to indigenous architecture, Mesoamerican mark making, things along those lines. So it's not only, quite beautiful from a perceptual gestalt kind of perspective, but also congruent to her research, which was really about, kind of taking a deep study into ancient mark making practices.
As part of the generative type class, she was interested in exploring the relationship between written and spoken language. So she used sound and time to manipulate letter forms. So here you can see some of those studies as part of that type specimen book that she did within her final. And this video kind of shows some of the outputs animated. So as we work from letters and words to sentences, students are starting to explore creating parametric type systems. So this is an example of how we do that. So students learn to think in terms of input and output. What are you using as an input to change a parameter, and what are the parameters that you're changing? Is it something like X height or weight, or maybe something more experimental that's tied back to a concept or aspect within a project? So here we have a variable that's connected to the mouse, and the weight is changed as you move the mouse across the screen. But now we have that same code. Instead, the variable is being controlled by this slider. And so as you move the slider around, the weight is changing. So this idea of input and output is talked a lot about because it's a really simple way of framing the work that we see out in the world and typically may think of being too complex to achieve within a 14-week class like this. So this is kind of an example of that workflow. As we're starting to prototype the ideas, we might use something like the mouse position to change something like the stroke weight. And then we might move on to using a slider, but this could really be anything. It could be a proximity sensor that's changing the weight. It could be a camera that's changing it. It could even be something like temperature data being pulled from a weather API. So this project by Hina Chung is based on an assignment I give in the class where students pick a word from the list and design a typeface and system that conveys some aspect of the meaning. So here she's working with the word decay and exploring types of digital decay. So this system has parameters that control glitch and mosh, which are inspired by the visuals that happen during glitching and moshing within a computer. So these same parameters have been translated from processing to P5.js, and they're now connected to data being pulled from the Wikipedia API. So as the page fills up with data, over time, glitches and distortion are happening in response to this kind of overload of the data. This is another project she did in the class and a great example of input and output. So she's created a way to control the behavior of the type using sound and touch. And the type itself is also connected to the music and acts as an equalizer to it. So moving components of the type around changes the quality of the sound. This project, which is a system developed by Vicky Liu, was part of a branding project for a festival called BYOP, which stands for Bring Your Own Projector. Because she's working with projectors within the festival, we had the idea to work with light to change parameters within the letters. So using a camera to analyze the brightness of light, she's adding or removing layers from her type accordingly. And the typeface is also designed based on the node-based visual programming languages. It's often used in projection mapping software. So here you can see what that might look like as an installation at the festival, and also see how the design of that type is also starting to feed into other parts of the brand language. This last example is by Chizu, and it shows a level of complexity students are able to get to within the demos that we cover in the class. So here he's working on a typeface that can hide and reveal itself within this larger visual plane based on that same assignment I mentioned earlier. The nice thing here too is that he's added a button below all of the sliders that randomize the positions of all of them, and it makes it easy for him to quickly see all of the different possible permutations of the type and surrounding grid.
What I love about this project is it's not only about very carefully crafting the shape of letter forms, it's also about designing an interface that allows users to craft those shapes unique to their own preferences.
So as we're moving from sentences to paragraphs, we work at completing entire typefaces that we can then type with, as well as ways of manipulating and using already existing font files. So these are some of the demos that I covered during this section. So students start to learn more advanced ways of working with code, from generating shapes and animations from points contained within a font file, like the example on the left, to rendering letters using other elements like circles in the green example at the top. This is a typeface designed by Annie Kwan, and it's based on a project that she was doing in Type 5 and media texture. So the rectilinear forms of the letters are becoming like a scaffolding and a way for her to connect points along the perimeter of the letter, which is based on her installation project. Students often complete typefaces like this in code and then export them as PDFs and use a tool like FontSelf to generate a working font file. So here's the installation that was done in media texture, and you can see the connection between the structure here and the letter forms that she designed in generative type.
It's a really beautiful project. What's interesting is that she designed the physical form first and then went into code and designed the dynamic typeface second.
And you can see that same kind of language applied to the posters as well. This is a project by Kyuta Sato that was done for CAST, which stands for the Center for Autonomous Systems and Technology, which is a part of Caltech. The video does a really nice job of explaining the project, but I also want to voice over a couple of things. So this typeface is designed to demonstrate autonomy, with each unit in the type system acting as an autonomous agent. So it's really nice to see how the units are continuously breaking apart and reconfiguring to show the messages as it's being typed in the software. And it's a really nice use of typography as the vehicle to describe and visualize the concept of autonomy, which is really core to CAST's brand.
What's also important here too is that Kyuta became Roy's TA and also my TA. And so what we try to create in our curriculum are opportunities for young designers to test drive the possibility of becoming educators later on down the line. And it feels to me like Kyuta might be a really good teacher one day.
For sure. So finally, as we're moving from paragraphs to bodies of text, we're exploring ways of analyzing and visualizing text and kind of approaching text as data. So here are some of the examples of the demos that we're looking at. which cover things like text analysis and data visualization. The goal of these demos and lectures is to start getting students to work with type and text as a form of data, and maybe make something that pushes our expectations of what generative typography is or can be. So this project done by Victoria Chen is a translation of a piece of writing into visual form. So each line of the writing has been passed through a different piece of software and is generating the images that you see here as a result. So it's analyzing things like vowel versus consonant, word length, and creating patterns that mirror the patterns present within the writing and text. So you can imagine the possibilities of this as a strategy for generating pattern in a brand design context as well. This project by Gabrielle Pulgar was done as part of a project based on the Whole Earth catalog. Part of her research involved collecting all the different text in and around the catalog, and she wanted to explore a different entryway into the text that would allow someone to see that content in a new way. So her project, called Data Poetry, is sorting through all of the different texts that she collected throughout her research, and it's stitching them together into simple 3-line poems. So this way of working to take text, pull it into code, and then generate poems from it kind of gives a new way of looking at and reading the source material. And some of the juxtapositions of the words and lines within the poems can be kind of profound or just nonsensical. But again, it's just another way of exploring this idea of text as data.
It's really cool work. The other thing that was really cool about Gabby's project was she took the kind of the ethos of the Whole Earth catalog and she brought it into a contemporary graphic design space. And so what she's allowing users to do on the website is to upload their own content, curate that content, and then download a unique book that's catered to their individual interests. There are a few spreads from that book.
So at this point, the students have gone through about 7 weeks of demos, and we have like a moment at midterm for reflection, and students propose a project for their final that uses the class demos as a starting point, oftentimes pulling in things that they may have also read in books or seen in demos or tutorials somewhere else. So we're going to walk through some case studies that show projects that have spanned across Type 5 and Generative Type.
Yeah, again, what we like to do is we like to embrace pedagogical cross-pollination between our classes. And so this project is by Jimena Amaya, and it's for the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. And here's the unique typeface she designed based upon a gridded system. And again, you can see that, you know, she solved a lot of really interesting problems within individual letter forms. You know, look at the way she solved the problem of the H, the K, the G, all quite original and all quite interesting. So she's exploring how the graphic language of her mark can live in time-based medium. So what you see here is a logo type that kind of provides a window into the inspiration for the design of her graphic language. So here we see artifacts and we see architecture and we see all these really beautiful, you know, kind of artifacts from the Aztec and Mayan cultures. This is her system for her ID collateral. Her system for her booklet. Here you see her typographic system recedes and almost operates like graphic wallpaper in the background in support of the artifacts which are pushed into the foreground of the posters. Taking that one step further, she was interested in reimagining the possibility of a poster not being something static and inert, but alive and dynamic. And here you see examples of 3D scans of these artifacts that react to one's spatial proximity to the posters themselves.
The structure of this site is really cool too. It almost feels like you could use the same grid within the design of the website that you would in the design of the typeface itself. So this kind of like grid system that she's working with plays nicely to the structuring of the content within the website.
Here you see how her graphic language inhabits a spatial context and urban environment. Also providing environmental wayfinding. And then additional signage for the library. This next project is by a student. Her name is Sarah Park, and it's for the Aura Festival. And what's really interesting here are the different ways that Sarah was interested in visualizing sound by manipulating letter forms.
So this video is part of her documentation for the generative typography class. And it shows the process that she went through of creating software that uses music to animate her logo. So here you can see she's using processing to load a series of MP3s and then analyzing the data from those MP3s to drive the animation behind the type. And because a lot of the music is beat driven, the software is using a beat detect algorithm to animate the logo every time a beat is detected. So here's a demo of the type's movement. And I think the choice to animate the weight horizontally is really nice too. It feels like a reference to music equalizers from old stereos.
What's also kind of cool here too is that, again, Sarah's thinking about posters not as something static, but as something responding to the surrounding sonic conditions with which they're situated.
And music played a really big role in the experience of the website too, as well as the app that was designed for attendees of the festival. And you can see how that type that she's created is kind of existing across all of these different touch points.
Here you see how her brand language inhabits all the different brand touch points, as Roy mentions, from wristbands to tickets to a schedule of events, a backdrop for a performance. And what I love about this is Sarah's resourcefulness. This project was something that she worked on during our spring semester last year. And halfway through the semester, we had to leave our classroom and pivot to online learning. So what Sarah did was she set up a projector in her garage and created a small scale prototype of the larger experience that she intended to design for her project. I just thought this was a really useful way of expressing those ideas. So again, during that spring semester of 2020, halfway through the semester, we were forced to leave our classroom, and we always tell our students that within any obstacle is a hidden opportunity, and it's up to you as a designer, as a creative person, to tease that out and do something with it. So what we did that spring semester is we recreated our classroom in a virtual reality experience. So this is a 3D scan of our classroom in the South Campus building of Art Center, and this was instrumental in helping to showcase the final presentation for the students' work, and also to kind of archive the work too. We see this as a kind of archive. It was a project that was spearheaded by Roy and by me, and by Ivan Cruz, who is one of our transmedia instructors, as well as Danny Gray, Chris Taylor, and Sharon Park.
So this is an example of one of the project pages, and it's a project done by a student named Christopher Gonzalez. Another really nice outcome of this site is it's becoming a way for students to practice compiling, editing, and presenting their work within a digital context. It's also become a way for me as an educator to connect with other educators. So I've been able to reach out to teachers teaching similar classes to mine and use this website as a way to introduce the work that we're teaching here at Art Center.
So it's a website that's dedicated to the work. It's called Transmedia.graphics. And it's a project that Roy and I will continue to kind of build upon and upload work and publish work. Anyways, you guys, it's something that you should feel free to visit and check out.
And with that,
that concludes our presentation.
So I think that if people have any questions, they could put it in the Q&A. But my question to you, and I know that the work is always amazing that you do. And could you talk about, though, that one of the points that you stress in the class is it still is about storytelling. You know, that we cannot be, if you want to elaborate that, how important that is in terms of developing the generative brand, it's still about how does that work with the story. I think that's so important, that it's not just about, oh, look what I can do with technology. You know, how much time do they spend on that, students?
Well, to answer
developing,
to answer the first part of your question, I mean, storytelling is everything. And I think we may have touched upon this a little bit in our last design intensive. But storytelling is a way that we connect with each other. And it's a way that we pass down information from generation to generation. And it's really something that is at the very heart of what makes us human. And so it's at the very center of what we do as graphic designers. And everything that we create in terms of form, all the tools that we use and the technologies that we employ, it's always at the service of telling a story. Whether that's a brand story, whether that's a story of an exhibition, or any other kind of story methodology. And so we're really interested in using tools and technologies, but again, it has to be at the service of resonating with an intended audience in a really special way. To answer the second part of your question, how you were talking about how much time does it take to create these experiences? Well, again, our classes are 14 weeks. And what we try to do is we try to be very strategic and structured with the way that we have assignments that build in a very logical manner over the course of 14 weeks. We're very structured about that. And the other thing that we're very interested in encouraging students to do is to take classes that complement with each other. So for instance, a student might take an advanced transmedia studio with me, a generative typography class with Roy, a media texture class with Miles and Ivan, and create one hero project that spans all those three classes, utilizing the expertise and the guidance of all the instructors at the service of again, one kind of hero project. And we find that cross-pollination is really powerful. What it ends up doing is creating a kind of culture of transmedia where the students come together and supporting each other from these different classes. And that's a really powerful kind of energy. The other thing we always do too, especially when we were able to access our physical classroom, is we would conduct weekend workshops. And those workshops are instrumental to, again, kind of like building this energy, this synergy between the classes, and really kind of rolling up our sleeves and getting our hands dirty. And kind of working side by side with the students in order to kind of build these prototypes. And sometimes your enthusiasm for a project can be contagious. And then other students see what one student is doing, and that kind of energy encourages them to, kind of really engage the project in the best way possible. And we're always kind of amazed by what we see for our final presentations from our students. And
Right.
and it's something that we've tried our best to continue to facilitate, even as we've moved to online learning. Now it's almost 3 semesters online learning, and so that's our great challenge right now, is to continue to inspire our students and work together with our students to create these holistic experiences that help to tell the story of a brand so that it connects, with an audience and resonates very deeply with an audience.
Yeah, I think, Roy, I think you should probably answer this. When do you think it should be a requirement that students are learning your coding and your processing? If you're a typography, a graphic design student, I think Mike Abbing from IBM would agree that they need to become familiar with the processing and the coding when they come into Art Center. You cannot wait by the time you get to this.
I think as soon as possible. I mean, something that me and Brad have been talking a lot about over the last year since I made the first generative design class is how early in the curriculum should this be? And I think it should be a foundation class along with like color theory and composition and layout and that kind of thing, so that students are, the thing that's really difficult is trying to teach code in 14 weeks and then having the students never revisit it ever again. Code is something that can be pretty complex. And if we were able to stretch the learning of the code over the entire curriculum, or maybe the second half of the curriculum throughout the course of a student's time at Art Center, then they would be able to get to a place that's really, really advanced, you know, as a senior. Whereas right now they have 2 14-week classes.
Yeah, and the thing about code is it becomes a way of thinking. And it becomes, in many ways, it kind of rewires the student's brain just a little bit. And I was asking Roy, as we were putting together the presentation a few days ago, if there's a point during the course of his class where he starts to see the students think a little bit differently because of how code has become a part of their typographic and their design DNA. You know, kind of seeing that light bulb go off and to start to see students think through code. I find that to be very interesting, you know. It's got an internal, as Roy mentioned, you know, it's got an internal logic to it, but it's language, it's communication.
Yeah.
You know, it's got syntax, it's got diction, you know, it's got many of the things that linguistic language has, spoken language, typographic language, and facilitating the process of a student making that connection between code and type and language. There's such an interesting and fertile space there, you know, in that kind of cross-pollination.
You know, it's kind of interesting if it could only be, if code can be substituted, I hate to say this, for French or Spanish when you're in, right? Middle school, high school. I mean, we're all required to take a language.
Here's what's so funny, Gloria. I have, you know, I have my little boy, Josh, he actually turned 9 yesterday. We had a birthday party for him yesterday. And he's already coding. You know, it's not coding not with what Roy does in his classroom, but it is a form of coding. He's very interested in it. And so this younger generation, of course, they're digital natives. And so they're very fluid in working in that digital space. And again, for them, you know, the idea of creating a tool or working in code is almost kind of second nature. Like, why not? They're not weighed down by the baggage of doing something in a certain kind of way, using pre-scripted tools and software like Adobe Suite. And I'm not saying anything bad about Adobe, but it is a prepackaged set of tools that we use.
So I have a question. If you were, let's just say you had an intensive, not dealing with students, but dealing with educators and especially typography educators who understand type already. How much time would you need to teach them, between you and Brad, to teach them how to teach this?
I would say, I mean, I think the basics of code is, especially with a tool like processing, which we use in the class, is actually really, really fast to get up and running in. Brad actually sat in on my generative design class over the summer. And I think that was one of the first times he had messed around with processing, and he was pretty blown away by how quickly he was able to get something made.
And sitting in on Roy's class over the summer, he has adapted his approach to online learning in such a beautiful way.
Great.
And, you know, he front loads every class with a presentation that provides students with an overarching kind of context for what they're about to do. And then in class, he has a series of exercises that he does with his students in real time. And the other thing that I think is really, you know, quite just really super smart in the way that Roy approaches it is that he's always very sensitive to making sure that code is applicable to what we do as graphic designers, that it's not abstract. That it is embedded within typographic practices or design practices. And so in that way, you know, it resonates with graphic designers, you know, so I think those are two things that are really quite important. And knowing how effective it is when Roy teaches it online, you know, I think that if he was to teach in a physical environment again, Roy and I were talking this morning, he's only had 6 weeks teaching in a physical class. and the rest of the time has all been online.
That's right.
But
So
if he's
maybe
been
Roy,
able
we
to
don't, yeah.
accomplish, have this level of success with his class online, I think that doing it in a physical way, in a physical environment, would be that much better.
We'll talk more about that in the classroom. We have to say goodbye to everyone who's here now. The classroom will start in about 15 minutes. Thank you
Okay.
everyone for attending. This has been terrific. And Roy and Brad, I'll see you in about 15 minutes.
Okay, see you in a bit, Gloria. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.